The first sound was not music, not the hushed anticipation of the wedding guests, but the explosive crack of the chapel's back door bursting open as if someone had kicked it from the outside. A sharp metallic slam tore through the solemn air. Then came the pounding of boots. 4 uniformed figures charged in like they were hunting a dangerous fugitive, each step hitting the wooden floor like a blow straight to the hearts of everyone witnessing the most sacred moment of the young couple's life. Ethan Cole didn't even have time to turn. Officer Mark Jensen seized his shoulder and yanked hard enough to throw his entire body off balance. A rough hand pressed down on his neck and a razor-sharp command sliced through the choking silence of the chapel. Kneel. Now. The order came out cold, stripped of anything human. From the far end of the aisle, the bride Emily Reed hadn't yet understood what was happening. Her white dress, soft as cloud, suddenly felt like an anchor rooting her to the floor. Her hand still rested on her father's arm, Sheriff Daniel Reed, but her body had gone rigid, as if frozen in place. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his shoulders trembling from the pain, as Jensen twisted his wrist backward. A choked gasp escaped him, tearing through the pride a man tries to hold on to on the most important day of his life. The handcuffs bit into his skin. The white fabric of his cuff turned red within seconds. A white rose, pinned to his chest, fell to the floor crushed under Jensen's black boot without a moment of hesitation. Its petals crumpled with a sound like something breaking. Emily wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to rip herself free from everything holding her still. But Sheriff Reed held her arm, not to restrain her, but because something far harsher was rising in his own chest, a warning forged from 35 years in law enforcement, telling him that everything about this was wrong from the very first second. His expression shifted in mere moments from confusion to suspicion, from suspicion to a suffocating, barely contained fury. The guests were swept into a collective shock. 100 people sat glued to their seats. Some covered their mouths, others instinctively raised their phones to record, as if they couldn't believe the reality in front of them. An older man in the third row, Ethan's godfather, shot to his feet, but his legs trembled too violently for him to step forward. Ethan's mother collapsed into the arms of those nearby, her face pale with terror and heartbreak. Mark Jensen tilted his head, looking down at Ethan with the warped excitement of a man who saw humiliation as power. "You should have known your place." His voice was low, but every word struck like an invisible slap. Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling the cold flood of shame pouring over him. But no. The strongest thing he felt was Emily's gaze. A gaze shattered and desperate as if someone had crushed the last trace of light in her heart. Sheriff Reed drew a long breath, his eyes narrowing with calculation. He didn't need anyone to explain anything, and he didn't need to inspect the arrest warrant Lieutenant Derek Hale was raising triumphantly. He knew Hale, knew the way he loved showing off authority, knew the history of complaints swept under the rug. And what chilled him most was the question burning through his mind. Why now? Why at the exact moment he was walking his daughter to the altar? Was this truly law enforcement or a carefully staged performance? Ethan lifted his head, eyes darkened but unbroken. In the dim chapel light, his face showed pain and suffocation, but also something else, something Jensen couldn't see, something Hale couldn't see, something most people in the room couldn't see. Behind Ethan's quiet nature and humble background was real strength, intellect, honor, and a position none of them had realized yet. He was not a man who could be crushed by a theatrical arrest, and Sheriff Reed, in the instant he heard his daughter scream Ethan's name, understood that what was being destroyed wasn't just a wedding. It was trust. It was the fragile line between justice and corruption. It was his own reputation as a man who once believed the system always knew how to correct itself. Through the cries, the shouts, the pounding boots of the officers, one thought flashed through his mind. The men who just shattered this ceremony had no idea who they had provoked, and he vowed with everything a father and a lawman could vow that the truth would be brought to light, no matter the cost. On the morning before the wedding, Ethan Cole stood before the small bathroom mirror in the apartment where he had lived for many years. The early light fell across his broad shoulders, highlighting the faint tremor in the muscles of his arms. It was not fear. It was the weight of a moment he had waited for so long, a moment his father, Robert Cole, once dreamed of, but never lived long enough to see. Ethan tightened the knot of his tie for the 6th time, then stopped and let out a quiet laugh at his own nervousness. 4 words lingered in his mind about to be a husband. They made his heart pound, like marching drums. His father had always said, measure twice, cut once. Whatever you do, make sure it is right. No cheating, no shortcuts, no selling your soul for success. Robert Cole had lived by that creed until the day his heart stopped on a construction site. And Ethan, at 15 years old, riding in the ambulance beside his father's body, had sworn he would live the rest of his life with strength and honor. 20 years later, he kept that promise. Not through luck, but through 80 hours of work each week, through sleepless nights spent reading documents, through persistence strong enough to shock even his former boss. When Cole Engineering was born, it was nothing more than a small rented office on Riverside Avenue with 2 old desks and a used printer bought from a discount shop. But Ethan knew that building a house began with a foundation. Building a career was the same. He paid off his mother's medical debt in 6 years, rebuilt the old home where she lived alone, took her to regular checkups. And every Sunday morning he drove her to church and sat in the same pew where his father once sat. To her, Ethan was not just a son, he was the answer to all the years she spent holding the family together. And Emily. She was the part Ethan never believed he would ever have. They met in the most unexpected place, a community meeting about the design of a new library. Ethan stood and spoke for 20 minutes about safety standards for children with disabilities, reading table heights for smaller kids, lighting direction to prevent sensory overload. Most people in the room stared at their phones. Only Emily sat there taking notes on every word. When she approached him in the parking lot afterward, her eyes didn't carry the look of someone attending a meeting just to show up. She asked about ADA standards. He explained for 10 minutes. She asked about barrier-free design. He explained for 20. They had coffee, then dinner the next week. Then 2 years slipped by like breath. Sunday mornings with his family, Wednesday evenings fixing small things around his mother's house, moments where Emily secretly photographed him asleep over his drawings and sent the pictures with notes like, "The best man I have ever known." But Emily had her own secret. A secret not about herself, but about her father. In her classroom, she was just Miss Reed. She rented a small apartment, drove an old Civic, and lived like any ordinary teacher. No one knew her father was Sheriff Daniel Reed, the man who oversaw all county security, the man with a record so clean, even political rivals couldn't tarnish it. Daniel met Ethan for the first time at a backyard barbecue 8 months into the relationship. He wasn't the type of father who interrogated or intimidated. He observed more than he spoke. At the end of the evening, he extended his hand, looked Ethan straight in the eyes, and said, "If you love her, protect her." Ethan didn't blink. "Every day of my life." The answer softened Reed's gaze, although his voice remained stern. "Good. Then I'll be watching you." Someone else was watching too, but not with kindness. Lieutenant Derek Hale, 43 years old, a spotless record on paper, 248 arrests. In the previous year, 12 racial discrimination complaints dismissed for lack of evidence. Hale didn't look at Ethan like a fellow resident. He looked at him the way a hunter looks at prey that wandered into his forest. In the week before the wedding, Hale's patrol car appeared outside Cole Engineering more often than usual, moving slow, watching, his face cold and calculating as if assessing a target. Ethan saw it but ignored it. He trusted the system, trusted Sheriff Reed, trusted that justice never turned its aim on the innocent. But he did not know. Some men did not need justice. They only needed power, men like Hale. And when Ethan stepped out of his home that morning, straightened his tie and smiled at his reflection, he had no idea that the very day he had waited for all his life was the day another man had chosen to destroy everything with a single strike. A strike that carried no baton, no gun, but the authority of the law twisted beyond recognition. The afternoon sunlight draped a soft golden layer over Willow Creek Chapel, yet inside Ethan's mind, everything spun into quiet, nameless whirlpools. He sat in the groom's preparation room on the same old wooden chair he had used countless times before, his hands still trembling slightly, no matter how hard he tried to steady them. His suit jacket hung on the rack, perfectly pressed, flawless, as if it had been created for this very day. But what tightened his chest was not the ceremony, not the eyes of the hundreds of guests waiting outside, but the vision of Emily walking in on her father's arm, marking the beginning of a new life. Caleb Johnson, his best friend and groomsman, leaned against the doorframe, watching Ethan with a mixture of concern and amusement. "You good, man?" A simple question, yet it pressed right into the core of Ethan's tension. Ethan smiled, though the smile tilted slightly from nerves. "Never better." Caleb laughed and patted his shoulder, but when he turned away, his eyes dimmed as if he were weighing something he didn't say out loud. He knew Ethan was strong, knew he had overcome more than most men ever would, but he also knew that the strongest people often became the ones fate hit the hardest. Meanwhile, just a few rows away, Emily stood in the bride's room before a large antique mirror framed with intricately carved wood. Her veil draped softly over her shoulders, her hair falling gently down her back. Her reflection held not only joy, but a deep emotional tremor that made her heartbeat flutter. Her hand rested over her chest as if trying to hold on to this moment before it passed too quickly. The makeup artist made final touches, but Emily's eyes stayed fixed on the image of the man she was about to call her husband. Memories surged through her like a tide. The evenings Ethan showed up at her door with warm noodles after long work days, the times he fixed every squeaky hinge in her aging apartment, the nights they lay together on her small sofa talking about the future, about dreams of a home filled with laughter. Emily's mother stepped inside, gently placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded immediately. "I love him, and he deserves to enter my life with every good thing I can give." Her mother smiled, but her eyes flickered with something unspoken, a worry she refused to spoil this sacred day with. Outside in the main hall, Sheriff Reed stood with a few former colleagues. The charcoal gray suit made him look less severe, though his posture remained straight and disciplined from years of service. Some approached to shake his hand and congratulate him on his daughter's wedding. Reed smiled politely, but his mind drifted back to the first evening he met Ethan, a quiet young man with eyes full of resolve. A son-in-law he never expected to respect as deeply as he did. He knew his daughter's life would be safe in Ethan's hands. For 2 years, he had observed the man carefully, and the more he watched, the more he recognized a kind of integrity that could not be faked, something rare in his 35 years in law enforcement. Yet his instincts whispered something else today. A subtle warning, like a shadow creeping from a place he could not see. The intro music began. The chatter in the chapel faded into expectant silence. Guests settled into their seats. Rows of polished wooden chairs stretched down the aisle, filled with the people who mattered most in their lives, all waiting for the sacred moment. Caleb straightened Ethan's cuff button and murmured, "It's time, brother." Ethan rose, drawing in a long breath. In that moment, his heart didn't beat only for love. It beat for the absolute certainty that Emily understood him, believed in him, and would stand beside him even if the world turned its back. He had no idea that in just a few more minutes, that world truly would turn away in the cruelest possible way. Sheriff Reed stood at the door of the bride's room. Emily met her father's gaze and nodded softly. He took her hand and felt a tremor in himself, stronger than anything he had ever felt in the heat of a pursuit. They stepped out together, the afternoon light washing over them like a blessing. No one knew these were the final intact moments of their happiness moments that would soon be torn apart by people they had not yet recognized as enemies. The sound inside the chapel shifted into a slower, deeper rhythm, as if the entire space were holding its breath for something sacred about to unfold. Ethan stood before the altar, his suit perfectly in place, yet the hands clasped together in front of him still trembled faintly. His chest felt tight, unable to contain a full breath. Everything he had lived through in his 35 years seemed to gather in this single moment: his father's dreams, his mother's sacrifices, the long nights of pressure and exhaustion, and the love of the woman now walking toward him. The music changed. Everyone rose. The back doors opened and the afternoon light streamed in, forming a halo around Emily's silhouette. Her white dress flowed down like soft water embracing her form. Step by step, she walked in with her father, each movement slow and steady, marking every second of the new life ahead. Sheriff Reed held his daughter's hand, but that steady hand trembled ever so slightly. No one else noticed. Only Emily felt it, and it surprised her. Her father was a man of steel, a man whose hands had never shaken, even when staring down the barrel of a gun. Ethan saw them, and the world narrowed to only 2 people. Emily smiled. That smile made him forget how to breathe. Forget the beat of his own heart. Forget the uneasy feeling that had lingered for days, the sense that something unseen was tightening around their lives. Sheriff Reed looked straight at Ethan, his eyes seeming to understand exactly what Ethan was thinking. He did not smile, yet his gaze carried acceptance and trust. He knew Ethan loved his daughter with all his heart. He knew Emily chose him not for his appearance, but for the truth inside him. And he knew that when a man was chosen by his daughter, the world would test him harder than anyone else. Emily came closer. The soft brush of her dress against the wooden floor sounded like gentle waves. The guests held their breath, none daring to interrupt the purity of this moment. Ethan's mother, who had been crying ever since she saw her son standing at the altar, tried to steady herself to witness every step of her future daughter-in-law. Ethan swallowed the tightness in his throat. He had always believed he was strong. He had survived losing his father, carrying the family's debt, and building a company from nothing. But he had never felt as small as he did now, watching Emily walk toward him. Small, but not weak small in the way of someone who knew he was about to receive the greatest gift of his life. Emily stopped in front of him. Their eyes met, and in that brief connection, Ethan saw all the love, hope, and future shining clearly in hers. "You look beautiful," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. Emily's soft laugh floated like a breeze. "And you make me want to cry all day. Not from sadness, from happiness." Sheriff Reed stood between them and placed Emily's hand in Ethan's. In that instant, no one noticed his eyes turning slightly red. A father's love needed no words. It showed in the way he let go of his daughter's hand, but kept his gaze on the man now responsible for her. The music softened. The space seemed to wrap around them gently. The pastor stood before them, preparing to begin the ceremony. Ethan exhaled slowly, his heart swelling with absolute conviction that life was stepping into a new chapter filled with light. But in that very moment, just as happiness reached them, Sheriff Reed felt a sudden chill run down his spine. He turned instinctively, the reflex of 35 years in the field, sounding a warning louder than any siren. The side door at the back of the chapel trembled. A shadow flickered past. And in the split second that followed, he knew. This happiness was about to be ripped away. No one else had realized it yet. The music inside the chapel had just shifted into a gentle pause, like a held breath when the next sound rose, and it did not belong to the ceremony. It was a small noise, but sharp enough to slice through the solemn atmosphere hanging over the room. The side door at the back of the chapel trembled slightly, as if someone had just touched it from outside. No one noticed. No one, except Sheriff Reed, who was standing in the exact direction of that door. He tilted his head, a reflex from decades on the job, sharp as a blade. In that instant, 9 parts instinct and 1 part. The quiet fear of a father blended into his eyes. Something was wrong, very wrong, but he said nothing. He would not disrupt the wedding, would not cast a shadow of worry on his daughter's happiest day. His fingers tightened slightly, even though his hand no longer held Emily's. It was simply a reflex to steady himself. The pastor began his opening words, his voice low and warm. Ethan tried to listen, but his eyes stayed fixed on Emily. Every meaningful line of the ceremony drifted past him like wind. Only her face felt real, her breath close enough to touch. He believed this would be the calmest moment of his life. He had no idea the storm was already at the door. Emily kept her eyes on him as well. Her gaze was clear and full of trust. She didn't notice that her chest had tightened slightly, as if an invisible hand were squeezing gently around her heart. A faint intuition, soft but unmistakable something, approaching something she couldn't name. A few rows behind them, some guests shifted in their seats, adjusted their phones, whispered to each other in emotion. None of them knew that in only a few minutes those phones would capture something so horrific that none of them would ever want to watch it a second time. Caleb stood beside Ethan, but his eyes weren't on the bride or the groom, they were fixed on the back door. He had heard the sound, too. A surge of unease hit him, the same kind he felt during the construction accident they narrowly escaped 3 years earlier. Caleb's instincts rarely failed. He shifted his footing slightly, preparing a dozen scenarios in his head, even though he had no idea what was coming. Ethan's mother, still overwhelmed with emotion and unable to stop the tears streaming down her face, placed a hand over her chest. Her heart was beating faster than normal. She assumed it was happiness watching her son grow into a man and begin his life with a kind woman like Emily. But it wasn't. The sudden tightness was something else, a warning she couldn't explain. Sheriff Reed turned his body, slightly glancing quickly toward the side aisle. In the corner of his vision, the shadow he had seen earlier slipped away. He didn't see a face, but he recognized the walk, straight, forceful, decisive. Not a guest, not a chapel worker. Someone from the force, but not one of his. A cold line ran down his spine. He meant to take a step toward the door, but just then the pastor reached the vows. Every eye shifted toward the couple. No one was allowed to move at this moment. Reed stayed still, but his shoulders tightened like pulled rope. Ethan took Emily's hand, the warmth of her skin slowing his heartbeat like a deep breath of peace. He couldn't know that this very gesture in just a few seconds would be severed ruthlessly by people who did not belong to their happiness. Emily opened her mouth, preparing to speak her vow. But at the very moment her first breath slipped out, the back door slammed open so violently the entire room shook. No one had time to react. No one had time to ask. No one had time to understand. Only Sheriff Reed whipped around instantly, his eyes widening as he recognized the figure rushing in, and he knew in the same heartbeat that what he had feared had arrived. And it had arrived in the most brutal way possible. The back doors of the chapel slammed against the wall a second time so hard that the echo rolled across the wooden ceiling and crashed down onto hearts that had not yet understood what was happening. 4 figures entered. Not walked, stormed. Black boots struck the wooden floor, each step as sharp as a hammer driving into someone else's fate. In an instant, the sacred space turned into a battlefield. Derek Hale led the group. His face was rigid and cold. His eyes locked onto Ethan as if he had been aiming at him for weeks. Behind him were Jensen Brooks and Miller Jr., all in full uniform, hands hovering near their cuffs and guns, ready as though they were about to apprehend a fleeing criminal, instead of a groom standing in the middle of his wedding. Ethan turned his head in shock. His ears rang. His heart skipped painfully. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. 1 second earlier, he had been holding Emily's hand, ready to vow a lifetime. 1 second later, he was staring at a team of officers as if he were the single threat that needed to be taken down immediately. Emily let out a strangled cry, her hand dropping helplessly as her world spun. Her mother jumped to her feet, eyes wide with terror. Some guests screamed, others raised their phones, and the rest froze like statues. Caleb moved instinctively, stepping halfway in front of Ethan. But Hale raised a hand to stop him, a cold warning flashing in his eyes. Ethan fought to steady himself, his voice rough when he spoke. "What is this? I haven't done anything wrong." His breath hitched in his chest, the world warping around him. Derek Hale pulled a document from his breast pocket and lifted it high like a victory flag. "Arrest warrant for Ethan Cole. Charges include fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to misappropriate county funds." His voice boomed deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. Every word scraped against Ethan's dignity like a dull blade. The guests erupted into panicked murmurs. An elderly woman in the middle row covered her mouth, her hands shaking. Others raised their phones higher to record. A few children began to whimper, not understanding why the adults suddenly looked so afraid. Emily lunged forward before Sheriff Reed could hold her back. She screamed, her voice cracking apart. No, he didn't do anything. This is a mistake. Stop! Dad, do something! She clutched her father's arm, desperate as someone clinging to the edge of a cliff. Sheriff Reed glared at Hale, his stare as sharp as a knife. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them to only a few meters. His voice was low but pulsing with a fury that trembled in every syllable. "Hale, what in God's name are you doing at my daughter's wedding?" Hale did not bow his head or retreat. He stood tall, his tone flat, as if reading a report. "I am carrying out a lawful arrest, Sheriff. Time and location are not restricted. The law permits this at any hour of the day." Ethan felt the ground tilt beneath him. He wanted to speak to explain, but before a word could leave his mouth, Jensen lunged forward, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back. A sharp cry escaped Ethan, causing Emily to scream and rush toward him. Caleb tried to hold her, but she tore herself free like a force of desperation. Jensen shoved harder, forcing Ethan down onto one knee. He fought to stay upright, but when the handcuffs snapped around his wrist, the humiliation crushed his chest. Jensen leaned close to his ear and whispered with dripping contempt, "You should have known your place." In that same moment, Ethan's mother rose from her seat. Her hands trembled so violently that the tissue slipped from her fingers. She took 2 steps forward before her legs gave out. Her body collapsed like a brittle leaf touched by the slightest breeze. People shouted for help, calling for emergency services, but no one could look away from the center of the chaos where Ethan was being forced down mercilessly. At that instant, Sheriff Reed took another step forward. He did not shout. He did not lash out, but his eyes, sharp and icy and filled with a terrifying anger, shifted toward the warrant. With a single glance, he saw something that was completely wrong. He spoke quietly, but the chapel was so silent every word cut through the air. "This warrant has a problem." And that single sentence, spoken by the most powerful man in the county, froze every breath and every gaze in the room. Because if the sheriff said there was a problem, then this nightmare was only just beginning. The air inside the chapel froze after Sheriff Reed's words. A silence heavy as lead dropped over the hundreds of people inside. Hale clenched his jaw, a flash of caution cutting through his eyes. Jensen still held Ethan's wrist, but his grip loosened slightly, as if even he could feel the shift in power filling the room. Sheriff Reed took another step forward, slow but deliberate, and that single step made all 4 officers instinctively move their hands closer to their belts, where their guns and cuffs rested. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his voice. But the force of a man who had survived more than 30 years in the field rippled through the air like a shock wave. He lifted his hand. "Bring me that warrant." Hale didn't move. "Sheriff, I am performing my duty. I am not obligated." Reed cut him off with 2 words, soft as breath, but sharp enough to raise the hair on every neck nearby. "Bring it here." In that instant, Hale understood that pushing further would mean confronting his superior officer in front of hundreds of witnesses. He reluctantly raised the document, but kept his distance. Jensen passed the paper to another officer who passed it down the line to Reed, as if a direct handoff might ignite the fury simmering beneath the sheriff's calm exterior. Reed took the warrant. His eyes scanned each line with expert precision. A veteran needed only 5 seconds to catch the flaws, and it took him exactly 5 seconds. The time of signature, the location of signature, the judge's signature itself. Every element wrong. He lowered the warrant, his eyes shifting from surprise to ice-cold clarity. In his mind, pieces clicked into place: the judge's schedule, the geographic distance, the electronic court system, and the recent conversations where Hale kept name-dropping coal engineering for no reason. All of it forming a picture he did not want to believe was real. Emily stood behind her father, shaking in fear and confusion. She didn't understand the legal details, but she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Her father believed Ethan, and that made her cry with sudden, fragile hope in the middle of the nightmare. Ethan was still on his knees, but he lifted his head. He locked eyes with the sheriff. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't begging. He was silently asking one question. "Is the truth on my side?" Reed answered that question with a voice low and heavy as a storm bell. "This warrant is not valid." The chapel exploded into panicked whispers, screams, and gasps. A few guests rushed to help Ethan's unconscious mother. Others tried to pull Emily back for fear chaos would break out. Jensen yanked Ethan's arm, using force as if to stomp out all dissent. "Stay still." Reed turned, and the restraint in his expression vanished completely. He looked at Hale with the eyes of a father who had been violated, a sheriff who had been betrayed, and a man who refused to stand aside any longer. "Where did you get this warrant?" His voice was not loud, but every word hit like a hammer. Hale kept his face stone cold. "The district attorney's office. The process is entirely legal." Reed stepped forward in a long, tense stride, making the three officers behind Hale grab their belts in unison. But Reed stopped and spoke in a voice just loud enough for Hale, but not loud enough to ignite panic. "I know this judge, and at the time written on this warrant, he was presiding in a courthouse 30 miles away. You just handed me a document that cannot exist." Hale flinched only for a fraction of a second, but enough. Enough for Reed to see. Enough for Ethan to understand that nothing about today was an accident. No mistake. This was a setup. Emily burst into tears, clinging to her father's arm. "Do something, Dad. Please." Reed slowly turned toward the officers. "Release him." "Now." Hale answered with a tone dripping with challenge. "I will not release a suspect when the warrant is still active, unless the sheriff formally suspends the operation, and if he does that, he is obstructing an investigation." The entire chapel went silent. Ethan felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. If Reed said one wrong word, he would fall straight into the trap Hale was setting. Reed stared at Hale for a long, long moment. Then he spoke a sentence that made every person in the room hold their breath. "I will not suspend it. I will prove your warrant fraudulent in front of the entire county." Then he knelt slightly, placing a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder in a gesture that was both protection and declaration. "But he is not going anywhere until the truth is uncovered." Jensen tightened the cuffs. Hale clenched his teeth. Emily cried harder, tangled between hope and terror. And in a tension so sharp people could hear their own heartbeats, Hale uttered 4 words that plunged the entire chapel into true darkness. "Take him out." And Jensen hauled Ethan to his feet, preparing to drag him out of his own wedding, leaving behind the woman he loved and the life he had just touched. Only one person understood. Every step from here would drag all of them into a war none of them could ever walk back from. Jensen yanked Ethan to his feet, the violent pull snapping his shoulder backward. A wave of shocked whispers rippled through the chapel as if 100 people gasped at the same time. Emily rushed forward, but Caleb wrapped his arms around her, terrified she would collapse before she could even reach the man she loved. She fought wildly against his hold, screaming Ethan's name, but her voice was swallowed by the rising storm of chaos. Ethan was dragged backward, step by step, his knees buckling from the sudden force. He struggled to keep his balance to look back at Emily, but Jensen's grip on his cuffed wrist forced him down, nearly bending him forward. Blood from his wrist spread across the collar of his white shirt, blooming into a searing red stain. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the look on Emily's face, her eyes wide with panic despair, and a heartbreak so raw it made anyone who saw it want to shout that this was a nightmare and beg for it to stop. Sheriff Reed stood in the aisle, his gaze sharp as twin blades. He stared at Hale with the realization that something far worse was happening, that truth itself was being twisted by the very people he once trusted. He knew this wasn't just a faulty warrant, not just a mistake. It was a fracture in the system he had fought to keep clean for more than 3 decades. Hale, however, did not waver. He stood straight with his chest puffed as if he alone held all the authority in the room. His voice rang out sharp and icy. "Remove the suspect. Now!" The way he said suspect made the air heavier. He stripped Ethan of his name, of his identity, of the reality that just minutes earlier he was a groom standing at his own wedding. Ethan's mother, supported by 2 guests, tried to stand again. Her trembling hand reached out toward her son. "Ethan, my Ethan." Her voice shattered like glass hitting the floor. Then she collapsed again, sending panic through the surrounding guests. Emily nearly fell to her knees at the sight of her future mother collapsing. She wanted to run to her, but the terror of losing Ethan pulled her in the opposite direction. She tried to scream, but her voice broke into thin air. "Stop! Please! Stop!" He did nothing. But Jensen did not stop. He dragged Ethan forward while 2 officers spread the crowd apart, carving a merciless path straight through the terrified guests. Caleb tried to push forward, but Brooks blocked him with a stare cold as stone. Sheriff Reed stepped in, blocking the aisle. Jensen halted. Hale narrowed his eyes, wondering whether Reed truly dared to defy him. The space held its breath. Everyone stared at the most powerful man in the county, asking silently what he would choose: justice or hierarchy, the people, or the system his daughter, or the rules. Reed didn't speak immediately. He only looked at Ethan, a gaze deep and unreadable, filled with anger, pain, and the helplessness he despised more than anything. Then he spoke, each word falling heavy like stones down a cliff. "He is not going anywhere far. And when I prove your warrant is fake, every one of you will answer in court." Hale smirked with arrogant confidence. "I don't need your approval, Sheriff. The warrant is signed. The suspect must be taken in. If you interfere again, you will be documented for procedural obstruction." In that moment, the whole chapel felt suffocated. Ethan knew that if Reed fought back now, he would destroy his own career. And Ethan could not let that happen. He shook his head gently, his lips trembling. "Don't let them drag you into this," Emily screamed, her voice ripping through the air. "I won't let them take him. Dad, please." Reed closed his eyes for a moment like a man stepping into a battle he could not afford to lose. Then he stepped aside. No one believed it, no one expected him to concede, but he knew to save Ethan he needed evidence. And evidence could not be found if he himself was cuffed at his daughter's wedding. Hale signaled. Jensen pulled hard. Ethan stumbled forward. Emily chased after him, her heels pounding against the wooden floor as if she were running through her own breaking heart. And as Ethan was dragged toward the door, he turned one last time. His eyes locked onto Emily, not to say goodbye, but to deliver a promise that needed no words. He would come back. He would fight. He would not let anyone erase him with a forged piece of paper. They dragged Ethan out of the chapel, the way one would drag a dangerous criminal, and every step on the wooden floor landed like a hammer, striking the hearts of everyone watching. But outside, where the late afternoon light stretched in thin gold bands, the chaos didn't stop. It simply changed shape. Ethan was pushed toward the patrol car waiting at the base of the steps, 26 steps from the chapel door to the parking area. Each one carried the sound of Emily choking back another sob behind him. Each one left a new streak of blood from his wrist, soaking into his shirt. Each one drove a blade deeper into the pride he had carried his entire life. But what hurt him more than the cuffs or the stumble down the steps was the fact that he couldn't turn back to hold Emily, couldn't wipe his mother's tears, couldn't tell his future father-in-law a single reassuring word as the man stood frozen in the yard, his eyes burning with rage. Emily tore herself free from Caleb's hold and ran down the wooden stairs, her wedding dress tearing through the air like a shredded ribbon. She nearly fell when her heel caught the edge of a step, but she pushed forward. Jensen spun around, raising a hand to warn her, but she didn't stop. Her voice ripped from her throat. "Ethan. Ethan, look at me." He turned even as Jensen tried to force him to move faster. Their eyes met for 1 second. 1 second long enough to tear both their hearts apart. Emily stretched out her hand, but the distance was too great. "They're taking you from me." Sheriff Reed stood at the top of the steps watching his daughter, then Hale, with an expression that blazed like a firestorm, eyes that had made criminals tremble. But today, Hale stood tall in the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. "Sheriff, you chose to stay out of this. You are only a witness now." Reed didn't answer, but his fists clenched so tightly the knuckles blanched white. Jensen opened the back door of the patrol car. Ethan was shoved inside his back, hitting the cold, metal edge. His breath shuddered, not from pain, but from the crushing feeling that the world he built was collapsing. Emily reached the car, slamming her palms against the window. "Ethan, I'm here. I'll come to you. I promise." He looked at her through the fog glass, his lips moving in a faint whisper without sound. "I love you. Don't be afraid." The door slammed shut, a heavy metallic sound sealing the fate of a man on the day that was supposed to belong to him. Emily pounded on the window, harder, tears streaming non-stop. "Don't take him. Don't do this. Look at him. He is not who you say he is." Someone pulled her back, but she fought with every bit of strength she had left until the engine started. A soft whine. The car began to move. Emily ran beside it for a few desperate steps, but her dress tangled around her legs, sending her crashing to the ground. She pushed herself up with trembling hands, staring after the car, eyes wide like shattered glass. Caleb rushed to help her, but she didn't look at him. She looked only at the car, at Ethan, until it disappeared around the bend. Sheriff Reed descended the steps, his chest rising and falling as if he was trying to swallow a fire, spreading inside him. He stared straight at Hale. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Hale let out a dry laugh. "I performed my duty, and you know that." Reed stepped closer, his voice low, but each word heavy as lead. "I know a fake warrant when I see one. And I know exactly who is behind this filth." "You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't know?" His eyes swept over the 3 officers nearby, making them lower their heads instinctively. Hale only shrugged. "If you have doubts, Sheriff, investigate. I'm perfectly ready." But his eyes said something else. They said he believed Reed couldn't touch him, that the system would shield him, that he had played this game too long, too well, too deep for an angry father to shake his ground. Emily rose on trembling legs, gripping Caleb's shoulder to steady herself. She turned to Hale, her voice cracking with fury. "You destroyed my wedding. You destroyed my family." Why Hale looked at her for a moment, then his expression slid back into that familiar coldness. "I destroyed nothing. The law did that." Emily let out a broken laugh through tears. "The law." "This isn't law. This is a trap. This is a lie. This is—" Hale cut her off, his voice slow and icy. "This is law enforcement." "You may not like it, but that's not my concern." Reed stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, keeping her from lunging at Hale. He looked at Hale with an expression no longer fueled solely by anger. It was deeper, more dangerous. A silent vow: "I will expose you, and you know it." Hale turned away, but not before a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed the truth. He was not as confident as he pretended to be. Inside the chapel, guests were in disarray. Some were tending to Ethan's mother, others whispering frantic questions, others shaking as they tried to comprehend what they had just witnessed in a holy place. The pastor stood, frozen hands clasped in front of him, as though praying for something no one could name. Emily sank to her knees on the steps, her dress catching dirt and crushed petals from the ruined ceremony. She placed her trembling hands on the ground, as if trying to hold on to the last trace of Ethan's presence. Caleb knelt beside her, but he didn't reach out. Her pain was too deep, too vicious to be touched. Reed looked at his daughter, then down the road where the patrol car had vanished. He drew a long breath, fighting to stay composed, while fury scorched his chest. Then he turned to Caleb. "Take Emily inside. I'll handle the rest." Caleb nodded and helped Emily to her feet. She moved like a ghost, her eyes empty, fixed on the space where Ethan had disappeared, as if staring long enough would bring him back. Reed remained on the steps, his fists clenched at his sides. He watched Hale's officers clearing the scene as though this had been a routine operation. They lowered their heads when they met his stare, not from respect, but from fear. Reed turned to face the road, his voice sharp as a blade meant only for himself, but carrying the weight of a vow. "I will find the truth. I will drag it into the light. And when I do, every last one of you behind this will pay." At that moment, the wind swept across the chapel grounds, lifting the fallen petals of a wedding that never had the chance to bloom. A ceremony shattered, a family broken, a system revealing its darkest face. And from the second Ethan was taken away, the fight was no longer between police and a supposed suspect. It became a battle between truth and the people who had learned to thrive in the shadows. And Sheriff Daniel Reed, the man who watched his daughter collapse before a patrol car, had just stepped into that battle with a fury and a pain no force of power could ever stop. The last rays of daylight stretched across the chapel's parking lot, but inside, everyone left standing there was only darkness. The patrol car carrying Ethan had long disappeared, yet the echo of the metal door slamming shut still cut into every remaining breath like a blade. No one moved during the first few seconds. Their bodies seemed unable to keep up with what their eyes had just witnessed. Sheriff Reed stood still, his hands resting on his hips, his eyes fixed on the long road where the car had vanished. The rage inside him was no longer a wildfire, but a block of iron, heavy and solid. He had witnessed cases that made him furious, had confronted criminals in courthouse hallways, had seen corruption shake entire departments, but he had never felt betrayal like this. This was his daughter's wedding day. This was the young man he had chosen to trust. And this was the moment when the system under his command had been twisted to shatter a family right in front of him. Emily was no longer crying out loud. She stood silent, empty, as if every emotion had retreated inward, leaving behind a hollow ache so sharp she could barely feel her legs trembling. Caleb guided her to one of the benches outside where she sat without wiping her tears. She stared at her hands, the hands that were meant to take Ethan's now left, with nothing but cold air. Ethan's mother lay on a long bench, her breathing weak but steadier. A churchwoman placed a cold cloth on her forehead, trying to soothe the terror she had endured watching her son dragged away like a criminal. All around the chapel, guests stood in scattered groups, whispering in panic. An older man shook his head. Why in the world on his wedding day? A woman answered with fury. This wasn't duty, this was targeting. Obvious targeting. A younger man tried to calm them, but even his voice shook. Maybe they have evidence. Someone immediately snapped back. No one with a working brain believes that was lawful. The pastor stood in the aisle, gripping his Bible tight. He had always been gentle, his words warm and steady. But today, his eyes showed pure helplessness. He looked toward Emily, wanting to comfort her, but his legs refused to move, as though not even his faith could find the right words for this kind of pain. Outside, Reed began to walk, slowly, very slowly. Each step seemed weighed down not just by anger, but by duty. He had been a cop long enough to recognize when an officer acted wrongly. But this wasn't just wrongdoing. This was orchestration, and he had never needed the truth more urgently. He approached where Hale stood, ignoring the wary looks of the officers around him. Hale didn't face him. He looked toward the chapel as if he hadn't just destroyed the life of an innocent man, as if he had completed a commendable assignment. His voice carried as Reed closed in. I suppose the ceremony's over. You should be with your daughter. Reed cut him off not with volume, but with a low tone that made the three officers nearby swallow hard. You just signed your own sentence, Hale. Not because you arrested him, but because you thought I would let this go. Hale finally turned, meeting Reed's eyes. There was no fear there, only triumph. You don't control everything anymore, Sheriff. This isn't your era. The air thickened around them. Brooks stepped back. Jensen looked away. Miller Jr. swallowed. These were men who once stood confidently behind Hale. Now they sensed something they had never seen before. Sheriff Reed was no longer simply a grieving father. He was the head of law enforcement for the entire county, and his anger, when aligned with the law, could crush anyone who strayed. Reed leaned in slightly and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. I will examine every detail of that warrant, every signature, every seal, every minute of that judge's schedule. And if I find even one flaw, you will wish you had never stepped foot here today. Hale opened his mouth to respond, but his words stopped when Emily's eyes met his sharp as a blade forged from love and loss. He turned away from her stare. Reed walked toward his car without hesitation. He didn't look back. He didn't speak again, but the tension in his shoulders made it clear no one should dare approach him. Determination, fury, and a silent vow that Ethan Cole would not be buried beneath a forged document created by dirty power. Emily rose when she saw her father getting into his car. She moved quickly, almost running, and placed her hand on the window. Her voice trembled, but was clear. Dad, I need you to find the truth. I need you to save him. Reed looked into his daughter's pain-filled eyes. He nodded once, slow and firm. I promise. And the car pulled away, carrying not just a man, but the storm waiting to break. Because wherever there is injustice, truth rises to meet it. and Sheriff Reed was driving straight into the darkness to drag that truth back into the light no matter the cost. From the perspective of a specialist in justice and systemic integrity, what happened at Ethan Cole's wedding was not a single, isolated mistake. It exposed deep fractures within a system that was meant to protect citizens, not turn them into victims. When power is misused, it can destroy families, communities, and trust in a matter of minutes. But it is also in those darkest moments that truth gains the chance to rise, forcing the entire system to confront itself and pay the price for the abuses it has hidden for so long. If you want to continue following stories that expose injustice like this, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss the journey toward reclaiming justice. And before leaving the video, drop a short comment. I see clearly now.